After having had a short lay-over in Chattanooga, I was on yet another Trailways bus and headed into the Blue Ridge Mountains. Home for a good many years had been on Jasmine Street in Eau Gallie, Florida, but I was headed to my parents' new home in a town I'd never heard of before. Having recently retired, they had bought a farm in Morganton, Georgia, which was a far cry from sunny Florida that I grew up in. I was remembering the time I had got on another bus 4 years earlier to leave for the service. I was flat broke when I left, and as I got on that bus my father had handed me a $5 bill and said, "Here, son, don't spend it all in one place." It, by the way, was rapidly depleted 10 minutes after I got to the airport in Jacksonville. I could write a book about my life in the preceding for years, but that will be another story if I ever decide to tell it. As daylight broke, I found myself looking out the window at lots of woods and mountains and curved highways that looped back and forth and seemed to get nowhere. I sat thinking, I've got one terrific future ahead of me here. There are no houses, no towns, I thought. I'll just bet there's jobs around here to be had. Must be a job behind every one of these trees. Well, I guess there must be jobs chopping down some of these trees. What in the world have I got myself into? Why did I tell the Navy, where they could put their measly $7,000 re-enlistment bonus? At least I'm coming home alive. A lot of the guys didn't make it back, especially those who were drafted and sent straight to Vietnam. It's a good thing I joined instead of accepting that dang draft notice they sent me from the Army. My train of self-pity thoughts were interrupted by the voice of the bus driver speaking to me. Time to get off this bus, sailor. Looking around, I realized we had arrived in a small town. Is this Blue Ridge, Georgia? I asked. His reply was, "Nope, this is Murphy, North Carolina. You will switch to another bus to take you there from here," he replied. I got off the bus, and after having found out when I would arrive in Blue Ridge, I got on a payphone and called the phone number I had scribbled on a small piece of paper. In my jumper pocket, my mother Helen answered the phone. I don't care to get into the specifics of why, but I always referred to her as Helen. I told her where I was, and that I would be in Blue Ridge around 11 o'clock, and I would get a taxi from there. She laughed and said she doubted any taxi even existed around there, but I would be met at the bus station. Nearly a year earlier, I had received a letter from home saying my father had bought a new car but couldn't afford to keep it, although I now suspect he just didn't like it because he had went right out and bought a bigger car. The car was mine if I wanted it, and all I had to do was make the payments. Included in the letter was the payment book to make the payments. Yep, that's the old man, all right, I thought to myself. He's still manipulating people as always. He got himself out of a lot of situations that way. If ever a natural-born salesman ever existed, it was him. I knew I was going to need a car when I got out anyway, so I just got a head start on it. A buddy asked me, "What's that?" he asked, pointing at the payment book. "I reckon I just bought a car," I said. "What kind of car?" he asked. Looking at the book, I said, "It's a 1969 Mercury Montego. What color is it?" "Don't know, and the book don't say either," I replied. I went below decks to write home and tell them it better be parked and not driven, other than to run it occasionally to keep the battery charged. I got off the bus at Blue Ridge and saw Helen standing across the street. I was glad to see her, and she gave me the biggest hug and a kiss and said, "Welcome home, son. Being reunited as a family is definitely like coming home, but this small town in the mountains of North Georgia would take a lot of getting used to before I could consider it home." "It's great to be home," I said. "Where's Dad?" I asked. "Oh, he's not here. He's gone to Florida on business, but he will be here in a few days," she quickly added. "How did you get here then?" I asked. She handed me the car keys and said, "I drove, of course." "Which car is it?" I asked. "It's that green one. Sitting there. Now you can drive us home. You know, I don't have a driver's license anymore," I said. "Well, that's okay, because I don't have one either. In fact, you might as well know. I've never had one," and she laughed. I was speechless for a minute. She had been driving for years. I had known since the age of 14, when I learned to drive, and finally took notice of her driving abilities, what a terrible driver she was. But it had never occurred to me that she could have such flagrant disregard for the law. I joined in on the laughter, and in fact we laughed most of the way home. On the way home I expressed my disapproval of him having left her stranded up here in this wilderness, and was about to ask what in the world ever possessed them to move here, but I didn't, because by then she was saying how much she loved living in the mountains, so I kept my mouth shut and didn't say it. Stopping for a red light, I saw a state trooper and politely waved at him. You probably are wondering, or perhaps you have forgotten by now, how this story has anything at all to do with how I got a railroad job, but I assure you it does. I must admit I can be slow about getting to the point though. It's just my style of writing. My 12th grade English literature teacher used to get quite flustered at the way I often used long run-on sentences, and I doubt he would be at all surprised to see that I still do it. All this particular paragraph is really about is me giving my brain a break before continuing with the story. Perhaps just in memory of him, mind you, I can throw in a few more comma splices. Heck, I've only got a couple hundred so far. Maybe I will end a few more sentences in a prepositions and split some infinitives, or commit the ultimate grievance and dangle a few more participles. I suppose the point I'm making here is I write just to record my memories and not to impress anyone. We arrived at the farm and I was impressed somewhat. It was a quite adequate white frame house, but I wasn't over-impressed. I saw her eyeing me to see my reaction, and I sort of laid it on a bit thick perhaps of what a nice place it was. I noted how nice the scenery was though, and how quiet and peaceful it was, and told her. The place was lovely. I could see why she probably liked it so much. It was a far cry from looking at the flat land of palms and Australian pine trees of Florida. I guessed she had her fill of Florida. I decided not to ever bring up the subject of living in Florida again to her.